Easter is an important day for us. The whole world recognizes, or at least most Western cultures recognize, some holiday in the spring to mark the beginning of spring. So you can look in commercials and other things, and it's all about, the spring fashions and the flowers and the rabbits and the candy and all of that. But why do Christians set this day apart? Why is this a day that we set apart and we gather together around the world to declare this simple phrase, He is risen indeed, over and over and over again? Why do we do that? Well, if you're not a believer, if you're not a Christian, or you're new to the Christian faith, you should know it's because the Christian faith is not based on a set of doctrines. The Christian faith, unlike other faiths, Judaism or Hinduism or Buddhism, which are all based on a set of teachings, Christianity isn't like that. We're not set on just a set of teachings or a set of doctrines. We establish everything we believe on one historic event that either did or didn't happen. If it did happen, then everything else that Jesus taught, those sets of teachings, are true and they matter. But if this one historic event didn't happen, then nothing Jesus said ultimately matters. And every church that's ever been built, every book that's ever been written based on the life of Jesus has been a colossal waste of time. See, we believe that Christianity is not based on doctrine or a set of theology or a set of beliefs, that Christianity is based on one event in human history, and that was that the tomb was empty on that first Easter morning. That there was a Jewish teacher by the name of Jesus who claimed to be the Son of God, the Savior of the world, that he lived a sinless life, that he healed people, he taught amazing things, that he predicted that he would be crucified for the sins of the world, and 3 days later, God raised him from the dead. Now, that's a pretty lofty claim, but let me tell you what that claim means. That claim means that Jesus can't just be a good teacher. He can't just be another prophet like Confucius or Buddha or any other teacher. Because Jesus said that he would die for the sins of the world and that he would be raised again to sit at the right hand of God the Father. If a man says that and it's not true, it makes him either a lunatic or it makes him a liar, but it does not make him Lord. But as Christians, we believe that what Jesus said actually happened. That he was crucified on a Roman cross, and 3 days later, God raised him from the dead. So everything we believe hinges on this one simple historic event that either did or didn't happen. Everything hinges on that. There was a man in the first century by the name of Saul, and he was a Roman leader. He had been trained in all the right schools, and he had all the right credentials, knew all the right people. And when this story of Jesus and his teachings and the coming of the kingdom of God was going about, and his death and supposed resurrection, the word just began to spread, and this teaching of Jesus began to spread, and he was determined to kind of squash it. He was going to knock it out, until one day, as he's going from one city to another, going to persecute these people who call themselves Christians, he has an encounter with the resurrected Jesus. And like that, he changes. Well, he wrote a letter to some skeptics in the city of Corinth. In this letter that he wrote to these skeptics, he said, look, I'm going to tell you all of this happened. This really happened. Here's how it happened. Here's why it matters. But you don't have to believe me. If you doubt me, you don't believe what I'm saying is true, here's what you do. Now remember, this is like 30 years after the events in Jerusalem of the empty tomb. Here's what he said to them. He said, if you don't believe me, it's okay, because there were 500 witnesses in the city of Jerusalem, a place that they knew about, a place they could travel to. He said, most of them are still alive. So if you doubt what I'm telling you, just go to Jerusalem and walk up and down the streets and ask for people, because there are people still alive there who saw the resurrected Jesus with their own eyes. You don't have to take my word for it. And then he later said, if Jesus isn't raised from the dead, then everything that I'm teaching, everything that Jesus claimed is a lie. It's not even worth pursuing. Now, I don't know about you, but I have come to accept the fact that we live in an age of skepticism. I mean, skepticism like maybe never before in all of human history. And you would think with technology and video and recordings that we would be less skeptical because there's more proof, right? I mean, you've got videos of things that happened. But have any of you seen deep fakes? You know what I'm saying? Like pictures on the internet or videos on the internet that they didn't really happen, but the technology's gotten so good that they can actually make a video look like something that happened that didn't really happen. I mean, that people are pushing this stuff as news, and you've got news news organizations that contradict each other, and political parties and politicians who contradict each other, and this whole idea of what does it mean for something to be actually true. We've become very skeptical, and it's not just in our generation. You go back and you watch the clips of the lunar landing and people who are skeptical about that, or who shot JFK. I mean, skepticism is part of the human nature. We've always been skeptical, but maybe never more so than today. But here's what you need to know. The people in the first century who lived at the time of Jesus and who saw the crucifixion and who heard about the resurrection were just as skeptical as we are. They were just as skeptical. Because here, let me give you a little secret. It doesn't matter whether it's 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, or modern day, dead people stay dead. It's just how it works. Somebody dies and their body stays where you put it. So they were skeptical just like we are skeptical. But there were several people, not just the Apostle Paul, but there were several people who had seen the resurrected Jesus, or who had met people who had seen the resurrected Jesus, who began to study and research and write these things down for us. Historic documents today that we have, 27 documents that are in your New Testament, but each individual documents that are the most reliable ancient texts we have because of the way they've been preserved down through the ages. There is more evidence today for the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus than there is for the existence of Julius Caesar. Let me say that one more time. There is more evidence today, documented historic evidence for the resurrection of Jesus than there is for the life of Julius Caesar. The historical evidence is overwhelming. In fact, one of these people who was writing about this is a man named Luke. Now, Luke was not one of Jesus' disciples. Luke was a physician. He was a historian. So physicians and historians, I don't know if you've ever known anybody who's a physician or a historian, but they're both very precise. They care about details. They care about getting things right. This was Luke. And Luke was not among Jesus' original followers, but Luke had heard the stories from Paul, the same guy who had been a critic of Jesus. He had heard the stories from Paul. And so he goes about to write down an account, to research everything for himself. And listen to something that he wrote to somebody else who had been told about Jesus. This is what he said. He said, "Since I have investigated all the reports in close detail, starting from the story's beginning, I decided to write it all out for you, most honorable Theophilus, so that you can know beyond the shadow of a doubt the reliability of what you were taught." Now, Luke is saying, I want you to know this beyond the shadow of a doubt. I want you to know that everything you've been taught, everything you've heard about Jesus and the resurrection, as hard as it is to believe, as skeptical as you may be, I want you to know that I have carefully researched this, and you can believe everything that was said. It is true. It is absolutely true, beyond the shadow of a doubt. So our question today is, in an age of skepticism, in an age where you don't know what to believe, even when you see something with your own eyes, you're just not sure if you can believe it or not, how can we have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? Some of you are here today, and maybe you're not a believer, or maybe you are a believer, but you've had questions and doubts, and maybe church is the last place you felt safe to ask those questions because you just felt like if you admitted that maybe there were some doubts in your mind, people might judge you or they might shun you or whatever. Listen, we all have doubts. Even the people in the first century had their doubts. It's okay to have doubts. But how can you have faith beyond the shadow of those doubts? Those doubts come. I mean, they come for all kinds of reasons. They come when life is disappointing. You face a disappointment. You go through a divorce. You have a tragic death in your family or with a close friend. You have a disappointment in a job loss, or you have a disappointment with a child or another family member, or maybe you endured horrible suffering at the hands of somebody. You're a victim of some horrible thing. You've endured difficult things. Those things have the tendency to cause us to question and have doubts. Those are the shadows of doubts that come up in our lives, aren't they? And they come up all the time. It's unrelenting in life. If you've lived long enough, you know this is true. There are so many things that can bring questions and doubts into our heart. How can you have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? Well, the good news is that the story of Jesus' resurrection, I think, gives us hope. It gives us faith beyond the shadow of a doubt. So I want us to look at the death, the burial and the resurrection of Jesus this morning and consider, how can we have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? If you have a Bible, open with me to Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 44, and I'm going to read the account. Remember, Luke, this doctor, this physician, this historian, took careful notes. He was not there, so he interviewed witnesses and copied all this down. And listen to what he said. Now, it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So that's from noon. They counted the hour from the time of sunrise. So you're talking about noon to about 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed. The curtain in the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." And all the crowd that was assembled for the spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, returned home, beating their breast. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance, watching these things. Now there was a man named Joseph from the Jewish town of Arimathea. He was a member of the council, a good and righteous man. He had not consented to their actions and to their decision, and he was looking for the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate, asked for the body of Jesus. Then he took him down, wrapped him in a linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb cut in stone where no one had ever been laid. It was the day of preparation, and the Sabbath was beginning. The women who had come with him from Galilee followed and saw the tomb and how the body was laid. Then they returned and prepared spices and ointment. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb. Taking the spices they had prepared, they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord, Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them, in dazzling apparel, and they were frightened and bowed their heads to the ground. And the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified on the 3rd day, and on the 3rd day rise again?" And they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other woman with them who told them these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them as an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Now, this is a remarkably detailed account of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. In fact, if you were to go look at other historic documents, primary sources of history in the 1st century and through the Roman Empire, you will not find anything nearly this specific. And it's this way in the Gospel of Mark, in the Gospel of Matthew, and the Gospel of John. They all give this level of details. Levels of details about specific people, specific times, specific places. Very specific. Why? Because these events were not made up. They actually happened, and they wanted the readers of these documents to be able to go and see for themselves that it was true. So can we have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? Notice that even the disciples didn't believe. That they didn't believe it. The women get to the tomb. They don't believe it. They have their doubts. Everybody in this story is filled with doubts, and yet they believe. How did they have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? Well, the first thing I want to encourage you to do, if you're here today and you are somebody who struggles with doubt, is to examine the evidence. Examine the evidence. See, believing in the resurrection is not a blind leap of faith. I mean, there comes a point where it does require faith. Anything you can't see or know requires a certain amount of faith. But you exercise faith all the time. You know how I know that? Because if you have money in a financial institution, you are exercising faith in an institution. You have faith, and you're in this room today, in government. You have faith in different organizations and institutions. You have faith in people. You have placed your faith in different things. To some extent, you have faith in where you are sitting, that it is going to hold you when you sit down on it. We practice faith all the time. How do you have faith in these things? First of all, you examine the evidence. The first thing you'll notice in this passage is there were specific witnesses named. There was a centurion who is a Roman citizen working for the government. All of his acquaintances, all the people who were there with Jesus, the crowd, the 11 disciples, but even more specifically, notice what Luke does. He names people. Joseph from the city of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and Peter. He lists specific witnesses who saw this. He had interviewed these individuals. He had gone and talked to them, people who had been firsthand witnesses. But he doesn't just list specific witnesses. He also lists specific times. Notice what he said. It was the 6th hour to the 9th hour, from noon to 3. Nowhere else in all of history do we have that much specificity over an event from the first century. We know exactly the day. We know exactly the time because of these accounts. It was the day the veil in the temple was torn in two. In the temple in Jerusalem, there was the Holy of Holies, which is where God dwelled. And on the day Jesus was crucified, there's a report that the veil that separated the temple from the people who could come into where God was, that it was torn from top to bottom. Everybody in the city of Jerusalem would have known the day the veil in the temple tore. Well, that was the day that Jesus was crucified. It was the day of preparation. Specific witnesses, specific times, but also specific places. Luke points out that this was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. He gets that specific about it. He also noticed that the women saw where the tomb was. For any skeptic in the first century who was alive who would have said, well, they just were confused. They just had the wrong tomb. They didn't know where they took the body. Luke's like, no, they followed the men who lowered Jesus' body from the cross. These women followed the body to the tomb. They saw where they placed the body because they knew that they couldn't prepare the body for burial properly because the Sabbath was beginning. So they were going to come back when the Sabbath was ended. And so they wanted to be sure they knew where the body was so they could finish preparing the body. There was a specific witnesses, specific times, specific place, but also there were specific warnings that this is what's going to happen. Notice that these two men who were dressed in these garments appeared to the women, and they reminded these women that Jesus had told them this would happen. In fact, it wasn't just that Jesus had told them. The entire Old Testament, the prophets had prophesied that something like this very thing was going to happen. The prophet Isaiah had said that the Savior was going to come. He was going to be a suffering Savior, that by his wounds you would be healed. All these ancient texts that were being reminded that this is something that had been foretold over and over again. If you want to have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt, I encourage you, examine the evidence. Examine the evidence. Any unbiased person looking at this event, looking at questioning the resurrection of Jesus, anybody looking at it would say, well, let's look at the evidence for what is actually historically accurate. And if they were being fair, comparing the resurrection, story of the resurrection, to any other event in the first century or earlier, you cannot compare the amount of evidence that exists for the resurrection. And it's not just texts in the Bible. There are extra biblical texts that affirm that these people crucified Jesus of Nazareth, that he was laid in a tomb, and that his disciples have been telling everybody that people have seen him, that he's alive, that he didn't die. There is overwhelming evidence. Examine the evidence. If any of you who are here today went through high school and you went through world history and you learned about ancient Rome or you learned about ancient civilizations, I'm just telling you, there's more evidence for the resurrection than there is for most of what you learned in ancient history, ancient world history. Examine the evidence. But the second thing you can do to have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt is to identify your assumptions and question your doubts. Identify your assumptions and question your doubts. What do I mean by identify your assumptions? We all have assumptions, don't we? I mean, everybody has assumptions. You have assumptions based on what you believe politically. You have assumptions based on where you went to school and your culture that you were raised in. Everybody has a certain worldview, certain thing that we look at, and this is how we see the world. But the question is, do you know what your assumptions are? Sometimes you get confronted with somebody who has different assumptions than you. And many times we just debate or we stay away from those people. They don't think like I think. I can't understand them. It's because their assumptions are different. Do we question our assumptions? Let me tell you an assumption that every one of us came in here with today, and that is that dead people stay dead. That is not a new assumption based on modernity and modern science. Everybody throughout the history of mankind has known that dead people stay dead. We all have that assumption. The women coming to the tomb had that assumption. You came in here today maybe skeptical if a man could rise from the dead. Of course you did, because that is a logical assumption to have. But the other thing we have to do, besides just identify our assumption, is question our doubts. Because I ask you, if God, who created the natural order, who put everything in all the stars, hung everything in space, if God was going to intersect human history, don't you think that it would be supernatural? Don't you think that it would be outside of the normal order of things? To say a man would die and rise from the dead as evidence that everything that he taught and what he claimed was absolutely true? Identify your assumptions and question your doubts. It's exactly what the people in this story ended up doing. Look at the centurion. Remember, this guy worked for Rome. He probably had been given the job of overseeing executions inside of Jerusalem for years. Maybe he had had that job in other cities and had been transferred. His job was to make sure that the criminals that had been condemned to death died on Roman crosses. That was his job. It had become normal for him. It was just another day with another execution. The Romans executed hundreds of thousands of people by crucifixion. Jesus was not the only one. This guy had seen them all. But notice what happens to this guy in verse 47 of chapter 23. Now, when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God. This is a pagan. This is not a Jew. He praised God and saying, certainly this man was innocent. This guy came in with an assumption. He came in with an assumption. His assumption was, Rome is right, therefore, Jesus must be guilty. I don't know what of, but they're just telling me to crucify this guy. Jesus must be guilty. He came in with that assumption. But do you know what he did? He began to question his doubts. He questioned his doubts. And he ended up saying, Rome is wrong. This man was innocent. Now think about this. This Roman citizen who worked for Rome is publicly saying, praising God, saying, this man is innocent. He was not only risking his job by saying that, he was probably risking his life, because he's basically saying, Jesus is right and Caesar is wrong. And nobody said Caesar was wrong. Nobody. This man was questioning his assumptions and questioning his doubt. He came to believe something in the crucifixion of Jesus drew him to the truth of who Jesus claimed to be. Listen, for some of you who are here today, maybe the idea of the resurrection is still just a step too far, but there is still something about the crucifixion of Jesus that captures your imagination, that stirs your heart. How could a man who was so good and loved so well and taught so many others to love well and taught us to love, how could he die? How could he give his life for his friends? How could he give his life for the world? Something about that stirs you and draws you. That's exactly where the centurion was. He didn't know about the resurrection yet. We have no way of knowing what happened to the centurion, although personally I think that he probably became a believer. I think that's how we have this testimony in the Gospel of Luke, that he became a believer and he was a witness that spoke. But what did he do? How did he get there? He questioned his assumptions. He questioned his doubts. But he wasn't the only one. The women also had assumptions. They had come to the tomb and the tomb was empty. Now I ask you, if you had been in their situation and if you'd been in their position, what would you have thought when you got to the tomb and the tomb was empty? Remember, you don't know the story. You don't know how the story ends. My guess is you would have thought the same thing they did. Somebody stole the body, or somebody's moved the body. They thought there must be some logical explanation. This was their assumption. And then these mysterious men in white appeared to them and asked this question: why are you seeking the living among the dead? That is a profound question. That is a profound question, because here's what is true about so many of my assumptions in life. Here's what's true about so many times that I've been in doubt. In the midst of my doubting, in the midst of my own assumptions, I have been looking for the living among the dead. I have assumptions that maybe if I have more money, I'll have more happiness. I'm looking for the living among the dead. Assumptions that broken relationships are somehow going to give me fulfillment, and I'm looking for the living among the dead. That I'm going to find life at the bottom of a bottle, or with some prescription drugs or in some illegal drugs, that I'm going to find that in there, and I'm looking for the living among the dead. We have all been in situations where we are looking for the living among the dead. And do you know what got you to that point? I don't know your story. I don't know where you were when you realized you were looking for the living among the dead. But do you know what got you there? Your assumptions. Your assumptions got you there. They led you to that place. And you are looking for the living among the dead. And these mysterious men, these angels, say to these women, why are you looking for the living among the dead? Everything you are looking for is found in the hope of the resurrection. These women came to the tomb with all their assumptions. But notice something else about this. And this is something that we might miss in our modern reading of the passage. But the very fact that Luke is giving this report that it was women who were first to go to the tomb and find that the tomb was empty and that they were eyewitnesses, and the fact that the disciples, these 11 leaders of the church, didn't believe. Now just put yourself in this situation. Luke is writing this story 10, 20 years after. He's doing all the research and he's writing it down. By this time, Peter's a big name. John's a big deal. I mean, all the disciples, they're on the speaking tours. They're popular. Everybody likes these guys. Nobody would believe that these guys doubted when they were first told. But why does Luke include that? Why does Luke include the fact that women were the first witnesses when women in the first century weren't even allowed to testify in court? They were not considered reliable witnesses. Why did Luke write this? Because it's what happened. I mean, I can imagine that Luke thought this is going to be hard for people to believe. Women were the first ones to see it. None of the disciples believed it. So why did Luke write it this way? Because it's exactly how it happened. Listen to what the theologian Tom Wright said. If Luke had been making this story up a generation or more after the event, as sometimes is suggested, not only would he not have had women going first to the tomb, women were not regarded as credible witnesses in the ancient world, as the story itself bears out. He would have had the apostles believe the story at once, ready to be models of faith and to lead the young church into God's future. Not so. It seemed to them a silly fantasy, exactly the sort of thing they will have thought that you'd expect from a few women crazy with grief and a lack of sleep. You see, they had assumptions in the first century, just like we have assumptions now, and they did not believe the women. They had their doubts. The disciples also were filled with their doubts. They had to question their assumptions and their doubts as well. They had thought Jesus was going to be this conquering hero. They had been told about a Messiah who would come, this king who would come, and he'd kick out the Romans, and he would save his people, and he would reestablish the kingdom of David, and he would put Israel back in its proper place. But Jesus wasn't who they had hoped for. He was supposed to be the Messiah. He wasn't supposed to be a martyr. He wasn't supposed to be a prophet. See, the crucifixion could have made Jesus a martyr. There had been hundreds and hundreds of Jewish martyrs, people who had died for what they believed in God. Or it could have sealed his credibility as a prophet. All the good prophets had been martyred. But the crucifixion was evidence that he could not be the Messiah, because messiahs don't die at the hands of their oppressors. This is not how conquering kings die. Jesus died at the hands of the Romans. Therefore, Jesus can't be the Messiah. And they were filled with doubt and disappointment. What are your assumptions about Jesus today? What are your assumptions about the resurrection? Maybe today you're here and you think, well, he's just another good teacher, founder of another world religion, in the same category as Confucius or Buddha or anybody else that you would name as a religious leader. He's just in that same line. Except that Jesus can't be those things. He can't be any of those things, making the claims he made. Because if he didn't rise from the dead, then everything he said has to be questioned. It has to be thrown out. Maybe today you're here and you've got assumptions about Jesus. You just think, well, it's irrelevant. It's a nice story. It's a good myth, a good legend, and like any other myth or legend, we retell it, and we have an Easter celebration around it, but it's not true, and it really doesn't mean anything 2 years later. But here's my question for you. That's an assumption you came in here with. But here's my question for you. How do you know that? How do you know? What led you to believe that? What caused you to doubt? Was it the fact that you had the expectation that somehow Jesus was going to make your life better than your life is? So when disappointments came, when hard times came, when there was loss, when there was that report that the diagnosis wasn't what you'd wanted the report to be, when there were disappointments, when you found yourself single, when you didn't want to be single, when you went through the divorce that you didn't want to go through, when there was no money left, when you went through all that, are those circumstances and situations what caused you to begin to doubt? Of course they would. I mean, that's the shadow of doubt. We all live in the valley of the shadow of death and doubt. We live there every day. It's no different than these disciples. They were disappointed. They had gone through hardship and would continue to go through hardship. Maybe your assumptions about Jesus is some sort of lucky rabbit's foot or a get-out-of-jail-free card. Maybe your assumption about him, like the disciples' assumption about him, was wrong. But maybe when you see that Jesus isn't somebody who gets you out of the problems, Jesus is somebody who carries you through them. Jesus is somebody who walks with you through the valley of the shadow of death. Jesus is somebody who delivers you not so that you can escape the grave, but he delivers you out of the grave and gives you life and new hope. What are your assumptions about Jesus? See, there's evidence that demands consideration. You would not reject anything else without personally investigating it. Have you personally investigated this? Have you examined the evidence? Have you identified your assumptions and questioned your doubts? Let me tell you something else I know about all of you in the room. You believe in something. You do. You probably believe in multiple things. Have you identified what those beliefs are? Is there as much evidence for your other sets of beliefs as there are for what there is in the resurrection of Jesus? Are you still looking for the living among the dead? And let me just give you one other word for skeptics in the room and people who have doubt. Maybe you don't even tell anybody that you have doubt. Let me just tell you something about doubt that hopefully will be an encouragement for you. Doubt is not the end of faith. See, we're told over and over again, if you have doubt, well, it must be something is wrong with you. It's the end of faith. Doubt is not the end of faith. Doubt is the beginning of faith. Doubt is where faith begins. Doubt's where faith began for the disciples after the crucifixion. Doubt is where faith began for the centurion as he watched Jesus die. Doubt is where faith began for the women who went to the tomb and thought somebody had stolen the body. It begins with doubt. It doesn't end with doubt. Maybe your doubt is the beginning of a great journey to come to know Jesus. But you can't be lazy about it. You have to examine the evidence. You have to identify your assumptions and question your doubts. And finally, and this is what I'd encourage you to do today, just in some simple way, and that is to act in faith. How do you have faith beyond the shadow of a doubt? Examine the evidence, identify your assumptions and question your doubts, and finally, act in faith. It's what the centurion did. He declared that Jesus was innocent. This was a huge risk for his career and for his life. But what did he do? He was so overwhelmed with what happened at the cross, he made a public statement. He took an act of faith and declared that Jesus was innocent. Joseph of Arimathea, a leader in the Sanhedrin, in the Jewish leadership council. He was a leader. He risked his reputation. He risked his position of influence because he was willing to step out of the shadows, take the body of Jesus. Remember, he doesn't know about the resurrection yet. Take the body of Jesus and publicly lay it in a tomb that is his family's tomb. He made an act of faith. He stepped out in faith. The women, they took a step of faith. They left the tomb and they went back and told the disciples that the tomb was empty and Jesus is alive. They risked ridicule. They certainly weren't believed when they were told. And finally, Peter. Peter even acted in faith. Notice what it said in Luke 24, verse 11 and 12. But these words seemed to them, Peter included, all the disciples, seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Peter didn't believe. But look at the next line. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. But Peter rose and ran to the tomb. Maybe today you are here, and like Peter, you have doubts. You have doubts. You're not sure. But notice what happened with Peter. He was going to go examine the doubts. He clearly had assumptions. He was questioning his doubt, and he took a step of faith. What was the step of faith? I don't believe these women. They've lost their mind. They're exhausted. They're overwhelmed with grief. They're hysterical. But let me go check this out. Maybe that's you today. Maybe that's you. And if it is you, I want to offer you a couple ways that you can take just a little step of faith. And here's the thing. If none of this is true, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then what does it hurt you to do this? It doesn't hurt you at all. But if it is true, it could change your life. It could change your future for eternity. A couple things to do. Very practical, very simple. We have a gift for you as you leave. If you would like to know more about the evidence that there is for the resurrection, not just what you see in the Bible, but what exists even outside of the Bible, we have a little book that we'd like to give you called The Case for the Resurrection by Lee Strobel. Let me tell you why this is such an amazing story. Because Lee Strobel was somebody who doubted. He had assumptions. Lee Strobel was somebody who did not believe. He was a very influential writer, a legal columnist for the Chicago Tribune. And his wife became a believer unexpectedly in their marriage. And it really disrupted his life because she started going to church. She started changing things. And Lee didn't like what was going on. So he decided, using all of his knowledge and all of his wisdom, that he would just set out and write a document that proved that it was all false. And as he wrote this document, he became overwhelmed by the evidence for Jesus and the resurrection. And he ended up writing a book called The Case for Christ. This little book, The Case for the Resurrection, comes from the research that Lee Strobel did to try to disprove the resurrection. And yet it ended up being one of our modern evidences that greatest pieces of research of modern scholarship in proving the resurrection. If you are here today and you doubt, it's okay. Would you just take that book and read it? It's probably about an hour and a half, 2-hour read. It's a small book. But what do you have to lose? Another thing I'd encourage you to do, for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to preach through the rest of Luke 24, and we're going to talk about the other 2 appearances that Luke records of the resurrections of Jesus. What would it hurt you just to come back? Join us back here at 9 o'clock in the morning or at 11 on Sundays. You can find it online anytime. But what would it hurt you just to continue to explore, to examine the evidence, to identify your assumptions, question your doubts, and to take one small step of faith, just to see if it's true. It changed the world, and it can change your life.